Salt Creek Road is a 7-mile road in Brown County, Indiana. It and Sweetwater Trail connects Nashville, Indiana to Sweetwater Lake. The road is a very narrow 2-lane road with sharp turns and graded bridges. I was 22 at the time. I'd gone with my buddies to watch the Monday night football game at the golf course bar just outside Nashville. Halfway during the third quarter, I told my friends I was done for the evening and was heading home. I wasn't terribly drunk, just a little tipsy at worst. I lived on Sweetwater Lake in my family's lake house that they'd owned for nearly 60 years. I'd only been on Salt Creek Road for a few minutes when I heard the approaching noise of a large truck. That's odd, I thought to myself. There are many other ways a semi could get to the lake that were easier to travel. Deciding to let it pass me, I slowed down and pulled over. I saw the 2 yellow headlights coming closer, and then nothing. The lights passed my car, but there was no source for the lights themselves. I could still hear the noises of the diesel engine growing fainter and fainter. Passing it off as some semi-drunken hallucination, I continued driving. And that's when I started to smell diesel fuel and blood. Off in the distance, I could see an orangish yellow light. I feared that the vehicle was on fire and reached for my cell phone, but I stopped in shock as I saw the entire scene in front of me. A large semi-truck had careened off the road into Salt Creek and the rocky cliffs on both sides. The engine had exploded, setting the contents of the truck on fire. The driver had been catapulted through the windshield and into a nearby tree, decapitating him. The body was still squirming, blood pouring out from his neck and everywhere else in his body. I pulled over and stepped outside, vomiting all over the pavement. I'd only dialed 9 when the body stopped squirming. It stood up and seemed to be facing me. The stench of his putrid breath from this far away told me that I wasn't dreaming. I thought I was safe when I sped off in my car, but I looked in the mirror and realized it was still following me at superhuman speeds. And it wasn't even walking. Rather, it seemed to be floating a foot or so above the ground. I floored it, only wanting to get away from this demon. On the side of the road were 2 on-duty officers, hidden just beyond a curve in the road. They camped out there frequently, hoping to catch drunk drivers before they crashed and killed themselves. I must have been doing 60 when I passed them, because they wasted no time starting after me. I didn't bother stopping. I would rather have been in jail than be caught by whatever that thing was. I just reached 80 when I missed a turn in the road, ploughing into the empty cornfield. I wasn't hurt, but the cops soon caught up to me. "Are you crazy, son? What were you thinking going so fast on a country road?" They questioned me as they put handcuffs on me. "Officer, there's something after me. I passed a truck accident about 10 minutes ago. It was terrible. The driver had been decapitated, but it started running after me. It went faster than any human I've ever seen. I could barely outrun it at 30. "Lying to the authorities won't get you anywhere. Now let's..." But the officer stopped short as the piercing shriek of something inhuman rang out. We all turned around, and I got a closer look at the creature that had been following me. It was around 6 feet tall, with filthy clothes and a dagger in one hand. They raised their guns in return, but in a flash it advanced on us, decapitating one of the officers. The remaining officer unloaded his entire cartridge, but the bullets seemingly bounced off the creature, melting into molten shreds on the pavement. Having run out of ammo, we took no chances. The creature seemed faster this time, and it was now screaming every few seconds. It was the sound of nails on a chalkboard, as the creature's claws slashed the sides of the car. Part of the rear bumper fell off with a clunk and tripped the creature, which crashed into the pavement. For a moment, we thought we'd lost it. I couldn't see it behind us, but the officer gasped and swerved to avoid something. I turned around to see the creature in front of the car, his dagger outstretched, and an evil grin stretched across the decapitated officer's head. We didn't slow down in time, and the sound of the collision was gruesome. The head fell and stuck to the windshield, now laughing malevolently in the voice of the officer. The innards of the head were now starting to ooze onto the windshield. He let me go without explanation. I never plan on driving that road again. Every few weeks, there's a new report of a decapitated person or farm animal around here. At night, I can hear the malevolent laughing of that creature and the scratching at the windows. My dog will bark and growl. It's been like this for 5 months now, and I'm the only one that still knows what's going on. The remaining officer mysteriously disappeared a month after the incident. I've tried sending emails, but they are immediately deleted from my sent box, or my computer shuts down while I'm typing, and I keep receiving mail that says the same thing every time. I'm closer than you think. It calls itself the Onyx, the Black, the Darkness. It is an ominous and otherworldly thing, slowly and painfully driving me to my grave since I was a child. I can remember our first encounter with clarity. The bulb in my nightlight had burnt out, and Daddy and Mommy were already in bed. No one was left to protect me. The creature walks hand in hand with the darkness of night, undetected, unexpected, yet perpetually feared. You see, this entity preys viciously on the weak of mind, the innocent, the unknowing. It is undetectable in the first moments of its arrival. No warning is given, no chance to prepare. It is simply there with you, whether you want it to be or not. It's followed me for years now. The 20th anniversary of when it first showed itself to me is approaching, and it knows I am near the point of surrender. The Onyx has mastered the art of enforcing psychological exhaustion upon its victims. Things go quite smoothly for it when it has known you since your childhood, as it has me. Most people would recognize it upon seeing it. It has no real shape or mass. It's just that dim, wispy cloud of hellish darkness crawling up your bedroom wall and looming in silent weight of your surrender to weariness from the day. I am very much aware of the fact that it watches me, invisible during the day, blatantly surrounding in the night. The moment light is extinguished with the simple flick of a switch, it exists, dominant and evil. The Onyx has been gracious enough to inform me that tonight will be my final encounter with it. Not that it's going anywhere, only me. I have no say in the matter, no control. I am under its merciless command. I am given no choice but to accept my fate and my final task, to lie in agonizing wait of the final visit of the Onyx. I'm starting to shiver. Oh God, I can already feel it. The sensation of several weights laid across my body is abrupt and powerful, pressing me into the mattress. I can't move. My muscles have stiffened to stone. I dare only to move my eyes, and I watch as the Onyx slithers under my closed door and into the room. It watches me from the foot of my bed. I am helpless, ensnared vulnerably with its insidious contemplation. It makes its way to the side of the bed, then arches its grotesque form over me, slithering what feels like a skeletal hand over my body. It towers over me, and its darkness overtakes me in its entirety one last time. Its delicate mantle of blackness glides across my face. I'm reminded briefly of a gothic and tattered bride's veil. The onyx hovers to the darkest corner of the room, taking its usual route up the wall and onto the ceiling above my bed. It stares triumphantly down on me, and stays that way for some time, seeming to relish the moment. Finally, it begins its descent. I close my eyes. Several sharp objects, almost like claws, dig into the sides of my face, leaving behind what I'm sure are angry, bleeding gashes. I can't help it. I scream. The skeletal hands are closing over my skull. Then, suddenly, what feels like a third hand, decked with needle-like fingers, forces itself down my throat. I gag and shriek hoarsely as the spindly fingers dig through my insides, burning and tearing with every careless movement. Distinctively, I feel the hand move with purpose as it closes over my panicking heart. It has me. The fingers tighten. My vision turns black. A strangled cry beyond my own recognition escapes my obstructed throat. The claws gripping my head begin to tighten as well. Pressure builds inside my brain as the skull begins to crack. I experience every little split, every microscopic break. Warm liquids trickle down the sides of my face, into my eyes, into my open mouth. My body is made of agony. And then there is nothing. They find me like that a few days later, eyes glazed and mad with anguish, skull in shards with unknown fluids leaking out, blood seeping from the ragged lips and gathering in a large pool on my bruised, unmoving chest. Mysterious, ink-black handprints stain my skin in various places. My heart, they discover, is oddly missing. Gone. Nowhere to be found. What could have done this? The officers and investigators ask one another. The remnants of my eyes roll around rapidly in their sockets, looking frantically in all directions. It's right in front of you, I tell them. But their ears are deaf to my warnings. Their eyes are blind to the things of this netherworld of darkness and ceaseless torment. I watch the creature follow them out as they leave the gruesome scene of my demise. The creature. My second shadow. My lifelong stalker. My executioner. The onyx. It's all around you. It will never leave you. Take my word. Take the word of its claimed victim. You will see it. Just wait until dark. Terror is coming home to find that everything you own has been replaced with an exact copy. Renowned horror novel writer Stephen King is quoted as saying, "Perceiving threats through natural intuition helped our ancestors to stay alive. Most of the time we can quickly guess if something is a threat to us or not, such as a falling boulder or having a gun pointed at us. There is that space between what we think is a threat and what is not one. This is vagueness or ambiguity. A dictionary definition for ambiguity is the quality of being open to more than one interpretation. Inexactness. Our brains can't exactly guess if something is a threat by looking at it, like a creepy mask or a clown. There is nothing wrong with a mask or a clown. There's just something a little off about those two things. It's just unnatural. Let's say that you walk down the stairs to get yourself a glass of water in the middle of the night, after everyone else has gone to bed. It's so dark in your house that you need to have a hand against the wall just to get downstairs. You start to hear little noises that you normally would have ignored because you've heard them so many times. All of a sudden, you hear and feel breathing on the back of your neck when you thought you were alone, and turn around to see nothing there. Well, something happened to me that might never be explained. This experience wasn't some kind of lucid dream or a hallucination. It was real. I was in shock, and it took a little while for my mind to reason with itself and accept the alien situation that I was in. How else would I just wake up one night with a tattoo of the number 3 on my upper thigh in a place that I've never been to before? A week ago from tonight, I woke up to find myself strapped to a chair with a black blindfold over my whole face. I thought I was hearing voices that sounded exactly like my own. Next, some unknown force took off the blindfold, and I found myself in a dark room where I could barely see a single thing. A light then abruptly appeared and made a humming noise, and I saw that I was in a small room surrounded by 6 other people, all of whom looked exactly like me. We were all silent. We had no idea what we could say that would be relevant to what we were seeing. "Hello," a muffled voice said over an echoing speaker. "You are all probably in shock at this moment, and have nothing to say that would put any of you at ease. You may notice the similarities between yourselves." "Where the fuck are we?" we all said in unison, and then sharply went quiet because we were so shocked to have had the identical reaction. Jinx. "It's all right. Your reaction is completely normal. Who we are is unimportant. It's the question of who all of you are is what you should direct your attention towards. Are all of you you? Or are all of you individuals, just like someone you may make awkward eye contact with on the street?" The mysterious man was not making any of us feel better. After all, we'd all woken up strapped to chairs in a dark room and found 6 other people in the same situation that all looked and talked exactly like me. And I had nothing to worry about. That's madness. Like I said before, anything that I say by this point will not aid in calming any of you down, so it would be useless to even attempt to do so. There is just one explanation I will give you before we all leave. There are 7 of you joining us here today. All of you appear identical, down to that little freckle you have on the back of your left hand. I looked over to my left hand and saw that there was that little freckle right underneath my pointer finger. The truth is that almost all of you are copies. There is just one exception. By this point, I was, for some weird reason, actually starting to calm down. I must have been the real me. Isn't it obvious? You are all, by this point, assuming that you are the real you. Am I right? This is where you are wrong. How could I be wrong? I must be the actual Joel. I know that to be a fact. I have all of my memories, don't I? What were the rest of these people thinking? We took the original one of you and copied your consciousness into the 6 other bodies that we created. And then we strapped you all to one of these chairs. You will all be set free, and you will not be harmed by us ever again. But there is one catch. One of you will be able to go back and live your life the way it was before, and all of the others will need to start over. The ones of you who aren't so lucky to end up back in the place where they fell asleep will probably start planning to go to where you live now and replace yourself with a person who is living the life that you believe to be your own. We will make sure that you are not able to harm the one of you who gets to go back to the way things were. This can't be happening, I remember saying to myself. There was a 1 in 7 chance that things would go back to the way things were. What felt like only a few breaths and blinks ago. After the man stopped talking, everything faded to black, and I woke up in a bed that was not my own, across from a huge glass wall outlooking snowy mountains. My chest dropped into my stomach. I wasn't at my house. My girlfriend wasn't right next to me. And instead of a German Shepherd at the foot of my bed, there was a laptop that looked like my own with a piece of paper on top. This is what the paper said. Dear number 3, welcome to the Dolomites in Italy. This beautiful mountain range is elevated at 10,968 feet above sea level. And it is where you have found yourself living. You will find a safe in the closet that will contain all of your financial papers, passports, a birth certificate, and other things of that nature. You do not need to worry about working. We have provided you with enough wealth to live comfortably for the remainder of your years, and there will not be a language barrier when communicating with the locals. You will not be able to do a reverse search of your face online, but you can follow the original Joel online and will be able to peer into his life. But it will not be possible for you to contact him in any way. Now, go out there and go on some adventures. Find a special friend and treat yourself every now and then. You are still young, and you have many more years in front of you. I felt so stuck. I haven't left my 3-bedroom house yet. Groceries were delivered yesterday, so I've been fine. I'm just sitting in front of this window looking at an old photo album. It has all the photos from my first birthday all the way up to my last few days of my old life. But there was one slide missing in the photo album. I guess it was symbolic of something. Then I went into Facebook to find Joel. And at the top of his wall he had 120 likes. Wow, I said to myself. I'd never gotten that many likes before. The photo was of Joel on one knee proposing to our girlfriend of 7 years. Maybe that was supposed to be the last picture in the photo album. But I will only be able to see how one of the 7 Joels lives the rest of their life through a Facebook and an Instagram page. I will never be at my wedding. I will never be able to meet my first child. I will never be able to sit down in a chair in the office of the job that I was working to have. All I can do is start over. Us humans live in a very strange world, which inspires so many questions that even the best of our thinkers don't have explanations for. We seek out answers, launching rockets into the depths of space, never to be seen again. We send boats into the deepest parts of the ocean in order to discover new places. But our brains are just too fragile to handle some horrifying truths. I lived next to this one kid who always had bandages wrapped around his entire head, even covering his face. I remembered his name was Wilbur, a 12-year-old boy who never left his house. He sometimes looked out of his bedroom window on the top floor at all of the kids who would play outside, while Wilbur just sat and watched. I remembered his windows had metal bars on them, so there was no way he could climb out of his bedroom. We sometimes communicated with each other by writing on pieces of paper, since Wilbur couldn't hear me because his window was locked. Wilbur only did this when his parents weren't around, because they were weird. His mother and father were those kind of parents that were insanely crazy about science and chemistry, well, according to Wilbur. They would stay in their basement and work all day and night, except for those times when they gave Wilbur some food daily. Now, they weren't treating him like an animal. It's just his parents were very busy. They told Wilbur that he shouldn't go outside or make contact with anyone until his face had gotten better. He told me that he'd accidentally slipped on one of his parents' chemicals and had fallen face first, ruining his appearance. And his parents feared that he would be made fun of by the other kids in the neighborhood. I remember one time, a couple of older kids were throwing rocks and pebbles at his windows, laughing and pointing at Wilbur as he looked down at them. He told me that they would do it a few times, but he'd gotten used to it. But to me, he was always a great guy, and still is today. I've never been inside his house, but he showed me some of the cool stuff he'd collected, like comic books. He had loads of them, from Marvel to DC to other non-superhero comics. He was a huge superhero fan, though. He even said that he felt like a superhero. A normal human being who became affected by dangerous chemicals and then became a powerful superhero, he once wrote on the paper, and then put it up to his window as he pretended to be a superhero. I had a collection of action figures and video games that amazed Wilbur. He told me that he'd never played a single video game in his life, which was quite sad. He also told me that his babysitter had taken them away before he could play with them, and burnt them in front of his eyes. Wilbur had a mean babysitter named Miss Fitzgerald, a tall, nasty lady who never liked kids at all. This had started before his face had even become messed up, he told me. She was basically every kid's nightmare. At least, according to all the things he told me she's done. Miss Fitzgerald had babysat many kids before, and trust me, it was not pretty. Wilbur told me that the last kid she babysat, a 4-year-old girl, she made her live through 7 hours of hell. Wilbur said that Miss Fitzgerald had starved her and surrounded her bed with a few bear traps, and the worst thing that had happened, well, parents didn't know about her deed. She would lie to them just to get paid. From all the things I've heard, she is a foul, cruel woman with no soul at all. And now, she had to babysit this poor guy. Wilbur was old enough to make his own decisions, except for some, but his parents apparently hired this evil witch anyway. The parents had to go to Texas to a science convention, so Wilbur was left alone with her. One time, I was writing about her to show to him, but then I saw Miss Fitzgerald forcefully pulling him away from the window. One time, I was writing about her to show to him, but then I saw Miss Fitzgerald forcefully pulling him away from the window. And that was that. The rest of my day went by without talking to him. The next day, when I looked through my window to see Wilbur, I saw someone lying down on his bed. Looking at the person's wrapped head, I banged my fist on the window trying to get Wilbur's attention. He slowly sat up on his bed, wiping tears from his eyes. He seemed to be crying, which gave me a thought. I had a worried look on my face as I saw bruises all over his arms and legs, a faded dark tone of purple. He went to write something down on a piece of paper. Then, as Wilbur finished writing, he came up to the window and pressed the note on the glass. What he had written terrified me. The whole situation still burning in the back of my mind. Something I knew I could never forget. He had written, "Help me." What made it worse was that his handwriting was scribbled onto the paper and was almost illegible. Wilbur kept banging on the window with his other hand. And then, suddenly, I saw someone else run into his bedroom next to him. Yes, it was her. You know who. She was holding something in both of her big, chubby hands. In one hand was a lemon, and in the other was a pair of scissors. What Miss Fitzgerald did next terrified me even more. She ran up to Wilbur, grabbing his head, holding it still. I saw him screaming in pain and fear, so I knew I had to do something. At the same time, I couldn't stop watching. She used her scissors to cut open the bandages and unwrap them off of his head, and threw them to the side. What I saw almost made me vomit. Something so sickening. I was utterly shocked at looking at Wilbur's real, deformed face. His whole head was completely covered by bandages, and what was underneath, I suddenly knew the purpose of those bandages. I saw his face, almost melted off, showing a dark red layer underneath. I could only describe his face as looking like melted cheese on a cheeseburger. It was Wilbur's whole face. Even one of his eyeballs was burnt a bit. The chemicals had messed him up badly. Miss Fitzgerald sliced the lemon in half with her scissors, pinning Wilbur down on his bed. Then she threw the scissors to the side, next to the bandages, and held his head still with one hand. With the other hand, she squeezed a lemon slice onto Wilbur's head, into his eyes, into the red layer of his face. Oh, the painful expression on his face, his loud, muffled screams, his face stinging from the acid of the lemon juice. She used the other part of the lemon to squeeze onto his face again, torturing Wilbur with extreme pain. I decided to bang my fist on the window, which was a bad idea. Miss Fitzgerald just looked over to the bedroom window, right at me. I jumped back because she had noticed me. She ran back out of the bedroom, shoving Wilbur down as he screamed in pain and agony. I knew what she was going to do, so I ran out of my bedroom and ran downstairs. The good thing about this situation was that my parents don't know about Wilbur, coupled with the fact that they were at work for a little while. I locked the front door hoping that Miss Fitzgerald wouldn't burst into my house. I looked around for the phone, but while I was doing this, a loud bang rang in my ears. I looked behind at the door, noticing her red, sweaty face and her curly blonde hair looking in. By the looks in her eyes, I knew there was going to be some trouble. She kept banging on the door, nearly screaming her head off. As I looked around for the phone, I finally found it, next to the couch on the coffee table. I ran towards it, dialing 911, as the sounds of her threatening screams could be heard from outside. After waiting for a few rings, I finally heard the operator's voice, the usual greeting from a 911 operator. I started explaining the whole situation from beginning to end, as quickly and as clearly as possible. They told me to wait patiently, as the police would arrive at my house soon. It took a few minutes for the police to arrive, and when they did, my parents also arrived early from work as well. Apparently, they'd got a call from the police explaining my situation and decided to immediately come home. Oh, my parents were extremely worried and frightened. They asked me more questions than the police did. I had to explain everything, from being friends with Wilbur to how his parents had left him with an abusive babysitter to what she had done. About an hour later, a police officer came to me. He had something he wanted to tell me about the horrible atrocities that had taken place next door. The truth about the babysitter, the parents, and Wilbur was truly shocking. Based on the evidence they'd found, Wilbur's parents weren't his actual parents at all. They'd adopted him from an orphanage that's out of town, just so they could perform an experiment on him. It was the reason why they'd moved to Texas, to hide. The babysitter, Miss Fitzgerald, was part of the experiment too. In fact, Wilbur wasn't the first kid to get adopted by these scientists. They had done illegal experiments on these orphans, and it was to find out how much pain a child could take before death, based on the cause of death and the age of the child. 38 children between the ages of 2 and 13 had been reported missing, and Wilbur was one of them. There were security cameras on the outside and inside of the house. Then they arrested Miss Fitzgerald for child cruelty and the deaths of so many children, and are now in the process of finding the two scientists. So, I was friends with someone who would have been killed if I hadn't called the police. Apparently, Wilbur also tried to lie about almost everything he told me. He was just trying to protect himself. He was sent to a new trusted family, a married couple who lived out of town. After that, I never saw him again. Well, until now. 20 years after that incident, I went to a bar to get myself a few drinks, when a man approached me. "Remember me?" he said. I smiled, realizing how long it had been since I last saw Wilbur. In fact, he now looks like a nice, healthy man, without his bandages. He's brown-haired with sky blue eyes. And, to be honest, he almost looked like a complete stranger. After that, we talked and drank a few glasses of beer, finally speaking to each other in person. Wilbur and I knew that nobody would try to keep us apart, that the scientists and the babysitter are probably still locked away right now. And I keep thinking about that again and again. The fact that this man would have been killed if I hadn't saved his life. As many scary stories as I have written, I've never told any of the true ones thoughts that have helped to inspire the chills and the thrills I've written about here on this platform. To start off with, I've always known there was something just off in the cosmos the day I was born. I was literally born on Friday the 13th at 1:57 p.m. Now, that's strange enough, but what I'm about to relate to you is just as strange. They do say truth is stranger than fiction, and how right they are. I've always felt like I was cursed in some way because of this. Or maybe I was lucky, I have no idea. I once went to a psychic who told me I was marked, whatever the hell that means. I come from a long line of interesting women on my mother's side of the family. There's a story about my great-grandmother, who was Cherokee Indian, and she had weird dreams and visions. My mother was divorced from her first husband, and my two older siblings had to go to Florida to see them by plane. It was the late 70s, and a few years before I was born. My great-grandmother, who was staying with my mum at the time, woke her at 4 in the morning to tell her not to let Robbie, my brother who was 4 at the time, get on the plane. She insisted he was going to get severely hurt in some way, and that she had dreamt it. My mum has always been a realist and didn't believe my grandmother, yet it unnerved her just the same. It was court-ordered that she put him on the plane, and so she did. A few hours later, she got a call from her ex-husband that my brother and sister had made it to Florida, but he wanted to let her know his father had died that morning, and he had the same name as my brother. My stories are just as strange, but 3 things stand out in my life, beginning when I was about 4 years old. My father used to belong to a bowling league in the early 80s, and when he had things to do, he would let me hang out with an older man that was basically like everyone's grandpa at the bowling alley. His name was Ike, and he was the sweetest man on earth. He would let me eat free food, make me milkshakes, and let me play games without charging my dad for them. He was probably close to being 80 years old or so back then. One evening, my family was eating at the dinner table. My brother, sister, my mom, and my dad, just sitting in our breakfast nook area eating, when the telephone rang. I don't recall who was on the phone, but I was eating my food and my dad whispered to my mom, "Who is it? Tell him you'll call them back when we're eating dinner." My mum ignored him, and I looked down at my plate of food and ever so matter-of-fact said, "Ike died." My dad looked at me sternly and told me to be quiet and eat my dinner. When my mum got off the phone, she was very sad-looking and looked at my dad. "You're never going to believe this, but Ike passed away this morning of a heart attack." My dad didn't even look at me, and I said, "I told you that. I already knew." I rolled my eyes and went back to eating. My dad and mom exchanged looks, and my older sister just stared at me in complete disbelief. My brother shook his head at me and told me I was a little weirdo. Well, I guess I was a little weirdo. I can't explain it to this day. How I knew it just popped into my head, and I knew he had died. I was more excited about knowing something that all the adults didn't know, because I was the baby of the family, and no one really paid much attention to the stuff that I told them. Years later, my sister recalled it, and relayed to me how creeped out she'd been by it. I also recalled later that night, waking up as though something had purposely wakened me, and looking out my bedroom window. There was a silhouette of a man watching me from the shadows outside. There were 3 duplexes just behind the house I grew up in, and an alley that led to a parking lot between each of them. I could see it very clearly from my second-story bedroom window. It was pitch black in my room, but I noticed a shadowy figure just standing there in the night, looking up at my window. I couldn't make out the face, but I knew it was a man. I have no idea if it was connected in any way to Ike's passing, but it scared me. I recall jumping back in my bed and trying to go back to sleep. There was something unnatural about it, and the fact he seemed to be looking at me creeped me out even more. Like, how did he see me? I knew he was watching me. It only happened that once, and I later forgot about it. Well, about 15 years later, a similar incident happened to me when I was 19 and in college. I'd been best friends with a boy named Brian when I was a kid, who lived down the street from me. His mom and my mom were good friends, and my mother would drive he, his younger brother, and myself to school every morning. We hung out a lot outside of school, and the three of us were inseparable. We were always on our bikes in the summer, or we went swimming in my backyard. I can't remember any part of my life from the age of 5 until I was about 10 that Brian wasn't around me. Then, one afternoon, my mum sat me down to tell me that Brian and his family were moving to Florida. I was obviously devastated at that fact, and it took a while for me to adjust to the fact I no longer had a best friend. Eventually, I moved on and made other close friends, but never as close as him. Around my senior year of high school, I was doing homework in my bedroom when my older sister, who was staying with my parents and I during her husband's deployment, came knocking on my bedroom door. I was annoyed, and then she said to me, "You're never gonna believe who's downstairs." I didn't know, I said, and then she told me Brian was on the front porch. It had been years since I'd seen or heard from him. When I found him, he was smoking a cigarette on our front porch and stood up, threw the cigarette in the front yard, and gave me the biggest hug of my life. We chatted for hours about he wished his family had never moved away. Things had changed for his family a lot after the move, and his parents soon split up. He told me how much he missed me, and how I was always his best friend. I recall thinking he was cute, but that he was a bad boy. He was driving this car that his uncle had given him with no driver's license. I was sad when he left, and he promised he would keep in touch. He did keep in touch, but his life was so far off track from mine. I knew he had anger issues and some drug problems. He called me one night to see if I would come hang out with him, but I'd already made plans with a friend of mine. When I asked if we could do it another time, he got mad and started going off on me over the phone about how all he wanted to do was just be my friend, and he knew I was just blowing him off. That was the last conversation I had with him over the phone. I'd tried to reach him after that, to try and talk to him and see how he was, but he didn't want to talk to me. Eventually, I moved past it. I graduated high school and went to a local liberal arts college about an hour from home. I'd been studying for my psych test that I needed to pass. I felt that going home for the weekend would give me the peace and quiet that I needed to brush up on my studies and do well enough on the test to get my grade up from the C that I had currently. My mom knocked on the door of my bedroom, and she had tears in her eyes. I looked at her as she held a newspaper in her hand. I sat up on my bed and looked at her. "What's wrong?" "You are never gonna guess who died." Again, something hit me, and I had no idea how I knew, but I knew. "Brian," I said to her. It had been almost 3 years since I'd seen him or given him any thought. Yet in that moment I knew it was he who had passed away. "How did you know?" she asked me. "I don't know, Mum. I just did." She looked at me, and I began to tear up. "How do you think he died? There must have been a car accident or something," she said. "He killed himself," I told her, matter of fact. "How would you know that?" "I don't know. I just do." There was this foggy feeling I had, and I can't explain it. It just so happened my mum, who was in the habit of reading the obituaries, saw it, and it was the same day as the funeral. When we got to the funeral, his mum, obviously devastated, told my mum she'd found him hanging from a rafter in the basement of their house. It was 2 weeks before Christmas. The last thing I've experienced was when my dad became ill. When my father was 9 years old, he was hit by a car and his leg was severed from the shin down. Because of the quickness of the doctor and his age, they were able to save his leg, as it was still partially connected by about 1 inch of bone and skin. He remained in a full body cast for an entire year after. My father had a bit of a rough life, and around that time his own parents had begun to have issues. My grandfather left my grandmother and moved to Virginia. My dad, one of 6 brothers and sisters, became the primary breadwinner for his family when he was old enough to work. He worked hard, and he played hard. When he was 39 years old, he had a double hip replacement. The car accident he was in at 9 left one of his legs slightly longer than the other. It wasn't noticeable unless you stared at it. That hip replacement led to 3 more surgeries in the right hip, mainly due to a staph infection that kept coming back. He had a ton of close calls his entire life. My dad and I were always close. We were a lot alike, to be honest. We both require a lot of alone time to think and rest from the world. I think I get that from him as well as my wicked sense of humor. He was a truck driver for nearly 30 years, and I was taught the importance of working hard, and it's one of the reasons that I've been with the same employer for nearly 20 years. My father had to have his 4th surgery in January of 2009. He never asked me to be there for any of his surgeries, and this time he asked me, and only me, to drive him to the hospital. It was something about how my mum drove him crazy, with her worrying over him. I was very freaked out, because the night before I'd dreamt he didn't make it through the surgery. In the dream I'd seen him walking in the cemetery, and I couldn't reach him to find out what happened. I woke with tears streaming down my face, and I was filled with this sense of dread. Not to mention, he'd insisted on me driving him to the hospital. I was very scared, and it wasn't like him. But he made it through the surgery just fine, and I felt a lot better. I chalked it up to my worrying and paranoia. He was sent to recover in a rehabilitation clinic, and one evening, about 4 weeks later, my boyfriend and I went with my mum to visit him. He was looking a little depressed, and insisted we come back the next day to visit again when he was feeling better. I hugged him goodbye, and that was the last I saw of him. Sometime that night, he suffered from a blood clot, and my dad, the stubborn man he was, died getting up from a chair on his own to move to his own bed. He fell on the ground and died. The strangest part of it all was when my mum called me. I was in the shower and missed the call, but she got a hold of my brother, who lives in Arizona, and when he called me, I knew. I didn't even know my mum had tried to call me. The fact that my brother never calls me because he prefers to text was a sign that something was wrong. But again, I had that weird, foggy feeling come over me. It's like the world stops and you can see everything so clearly. I could smell my father everywhere that night too. It was as if he was hovering around me, or maybe it was my mind playing tricks on my nose. It doesn't end there, though. Later that same night, when I finally fell asleep, I had another dream. I saw my dad, and the only thing he said to me was, "I tried. I'm sorry. And I love you too much, baby girl." I think this was because my dad had tried for years to overcome all the physical pain and all the surgeries he'd went through. It wore on him physically and emotionally. Well, I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I'm sharing these stories anyway. I can't explain knowing about Ike, Brian, or the dreams about my dad's passing. Maybe it was instinct or something warning me to prepare me. Maybe it gives way to something like hope or understanding. Not everything that goes bump in the night is bad, and some of us, for whatever reason, have these preternatural experiences we can't explain. I for sure can't explain away any of this. He opened his eyes and looked about the room. Light from the door, the only illumination. He let his eyes wander over the items in the room, strange things that he did not know the use of. Above his head, he saw a screen with strange writing scrolling across it. He had no idea how long he had been there, nor did he know where he even was. All he knew was that he'd been taken there a long, long time before, that he was lying in a bed of sorts and that he was thirsty, so very thirsty. His mouth was dry and his tongue feeling sticky and swollen. His lips dry and in danger of cracking. Feeling a need to move, he felt resistance in his wrists. His arms were bound to the bed. His heart rate accelerating a bit as fear washed over him, and he began struggling against the restraints. Sounds and movement in the doorway distracted him momentarily, his fear growing as the sounds came closer. Closing his eyes against the pain as a sudden bright light pierced his eyes. Opening them again, he recoiled in fear from the sight before him. Two creatures had come into the room and were approaching him. Even if forced, he could not begin to describe the horror that was these two creatures. They flanked him and looked down on him. One seemed to be the leader, as it was trying to communicate, some incomprehensible gibberish spewing from what could have been called a mouth only in the most generous sense of the word. The creatures then pulled the covers from him, leaving him only covered in a very thin cloth. He began struggling again, whimpering in fear. What were they going to do to him now? The creatures moved him around, turning him this way and that. They released the things holding his arms, tied down, and he began fighting against them. The lead creature was apparently upset and was chastising him, the voice sharp. He soon gave up trying to fight his captors, not because he feared angering them, but because of the fatigue that overcame him. He lay there, shocked and defeated, stunned at the weakness in his body. He was sure that he had once been a strong man. The creature stripped him and began rubbing a strange wet substance over his body. Finally, they finished manipulating him, leaving him in a different position than before, again covered in the cloth and a fabric covering. One creature moved away and returned with a package. It spoke again to him, and then pushed something into his mouth. The texture, slightly rough, but moist. At first, relief washed over him, as his parched mouth was wet, but then a stinging sensation and a strange taste hit him. He turned his head away as he sunk even deeper into despair. He closed his eyes, trying to shut out the world that was now his hell, and heard the creatures leaving the room, chattering to each other. outside the room." "Thanks, Cam. Let me know when you need help with your baths," Jan said, looking at her friend and co-worker. Glancing back, looking sadly into the room they'd just left, Cam nodded and then stopped. "What's wrong, Jan?" Jan shook her head. "I don't know. Did you see his eyes? The way he looked at us?" She looks back at the patient. "He looked terrified." Cam nods again, also looking into the room. "Yeah, I thought so too. He has dementia, yeah?" "Yes, he does. I wonder." Jan pauses, thinking. I know they lose their memory and all, but I just wonder. What if they lose the ability to recognize human faces too? Cam looks at Jan, horrified. "Oh my God. What if they do?" Jen picks up the thought. What does he think we are? What does he think we're doing to him? Both nurses shudder at the thought, looking sadly at the patient. Jen wonders out loud. What are we doing to him? This is a true story of one of the most terrifying nights I've ever experienced in my life. Now, to preface this story, I'll give you a little background information on me, of what I was like when this happened. At the time, I was in middle school and wasn't very happy with my life. I was constantly teased about being overweight and was even bullied to the point of physical assault by others. Trying to tell adults only resulted in worse things happening to me. I was a preteen who wanted to die and hated myself more than anything else in the world. I was isolated, emotionally, and had no one to talk to. My parents aren't the kind of people, or forgiving. They've always made it clear that they have no remorse or worry for what ultimately happens to me. So, like anyone that feels alone, I was constantly, seeing things. Oh yes, I could see strange things all around me. Things others didn't consider odd or, couldn't even see. On the night in question that I'm about to talk about, it was a Friday night. I only remember because I was able to sleep in without any incident or anyone really bothering me. I lay in the room that I shared with my baby sister. We're only 5 years apart in age, and despite that, I get along with her very well. Not so much with my other sisters. All of them were older than me. As I lay in my twin-sized bed, I did my best to fall asleep. Though it escaped my grasp, and all I could do was simply lay there and wait till I finally tired enough to sleep. Apparently, it didn't take as long as I thought, but it didn't last. With an odd taste in the back of my mouth, I opened my eyes to see I was facing my sister's bed and the door to our room. It was wide open because our parents wouldn't allow us to close it, even though having it open always made it impossible for me to sleep. Mainly because our bedroom was a corner turn from the hallway. Leaving a space like that made it impossible to see if someone was coming. At night, when the house was dark, I could see shadows forming and moving close to the edge. I was always scolded for telling my parents about them, and instead of easing any of my fears, they only made me feel like I was insane for even thinking that it was possible that I could see one of the shadows, as if something were going to peek from around the corner at any moment, but, of course it never did. I tried to focus on something else and return my gaze to my sister's bed. Oddly enough, it was empty. I paused to listen and wondered if she was simply in the bathroom, but there was no sound, nor any light coming from the bathroom. if someone was in the bathroom, I could see the light from under the door because it showed on the wall and could be seen from where I lay in my bed. Without any real reason, I sat up. Thinking back on it, I'm not sure I even did this of my own accord. I was afraid of the dark, and kind of still am, but apparently that didn't stop me that night. Without any caution or thought, I made my way to the hallway and found that the front door was wide open. I then looked to the other end of the mobile home that I lived in with my parents. Their room was at the very end, and their door was also open. I walked past the front door to my parents' room and looked around to find that both of them were not in bed. I looked up to the bathroom, and it was empty too. Heading over to their walk-in closet, well, no one was in there either. My brain was screaming for me to hide, to stop and just stay still. But I left my parents' room and went to tell my oldest sister. She had the room next to mine, and going into her room, I found it was empty as well. I closed the door to her room and headed over to the front door to see if someone was out there. I figured I would see them standing there, or maybe even just sitting. Nothing was out there. I was simply confused. Where had all my family gone? Why was I alone and the door wide open? Thank God my mind finally took over from my body, and I ran to my room intending to hide in there with the door shut and locked. At least, that was the plan. And as I ran to my room, well, I didn't make it. I was reaching the end of the hall, getting ready to turn into my room, when it happened. I slammed into something. So solid, but nothing was there. I remember the horrible sensation of biting my tongue and feeling blood drip down my face, getting on the carpet, and that I was so scared. I was really, truly terrified, but I didn't have to deal with that much longer because it all turned black on me. I woke up the next day in bed, feeling a horrible ache behind my eyes, and my nose still hurt. Sitting up slowly, I could hear the television on in the living room and the sounds of food being cooked. I stumbled out of the bed and went to the hallway, looking around and seeing my parents were sitting in the kitchen. I wanted to ask why they'd left, where they'd gone and what happened. I did manage to say, "You all left me alone last night." I would tell you about the whole argument that followed, but I'll keep that short. I was told that I'd been dreaming, that I watched too many scary movies, and that I needed to stop making things up. I was treated like I usually was, with dismissal over anything I felt. I left them and headed back to my room, head staring down at my feet. Then I saw something caked on the carpet, something dried. I dropped down and started to pick at the stuff and brought up dirty, brown, dried blood. I thought, yeah, this is enough. This would prove it. But instead, they all simply said, "It's mud." Well, it was the dry season in the desert. They say I lied, and I made it up for attention. I need to stop watching horror movies. I remember that night, though, and I know and feel deep down inside me that someone is watching me. Not at all times, but every time I'm out, I can feel like someone is watching me just far enough that I can't see them. I've been told by only a few people that if I feel that way, it means someone is watching me. But even though as we've evolved, humans still retain a few senses that can alert us. So, even if I thought I was alone at times. I knew someone was watching me, but wouldn't let me see them. This is real. I know it sounds so out there and far-fetched, but this happened to me. This horrible thing that I wish was a story, that I could laugh off and say, "Ha, gotcha," is actually something that I had to suffer through. I'll never forget that night, no matter how hard I try. Because everyone left me alone at a time when I was so scared, and there are moments in your life that no matter what happens, you will never forget. And, well, there are moments in your life that no matter what happens, you will never forget.